Cyrus Vale did not knock. He walked into Lenora Ashby's rented room above the Mason Hollow dry goods store at 6 in the morning, turned the key he had no right to carry, and dropped a single folded paper onto the table where she was feeding her 10-year-old daughter breakfast. He didn't look at Maisie. He looked only at Lenora, with the calm, unhurried expression of a man who had never once in his life been told no and actually believed it. "Leave before Sunday," he said. "Both of you. Or I file the abandonment claim and the girl goes to the county home." Maisie stopped chewing. Lenora's hand went flat on the table. Cyrus adjusted his coat, turned, and walked back out. He didn't slam the door. He didn't need to. Men like Cyrus Vale never wasted rage. They spent patience instead, slow, deliberate, and suffocating as a hand over the mouth. If this story hit you somewhere deep, you're not alone. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens. Next stories like this one travel far, and we want to know how far. Drop a like, and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. Let's find out together how far one story can go. The morning Lenora Ashby came back to Mason Hollow, the town was not ready for her. Nobody ever is, when the person they wrote off decides to stop being written off. She had timed it deliberately sunrise, when the streets were still mostly empty, and the light was still soft enough that a woman arriving on a wagon with a child and 2 worn traveling bags might not draw attention before she was ready to draw it. Lenora had learned a long time ago that attention was something you wanted to choose, not something you wanted chosen for you. She had learned it the hard way, in the particular way that women who survive on their own across a decade of frontier winters tend to learn everything through cold and hunger, and the specific exhaustion of having to be twice as careful as any man just to move through a room without someone deciding your business was their business. She was 31 years old. She had the kind of face that had probably been called pretty at 20 and was now something more complicated than that, not harder exactly, but settled. Like a piece of wood that had been outdoors long enough to know its own grain. Beside her on the wagon bench, Maisie sat with her spine straight and her chin slightly elevated in the way she always did when she was nervous and trying not to show it. She was 11. She had her mother's mouth and her mother's stubbornness, and though Lenora had never once said this aloud, the steel-gray eyes of a man Lenora had not spoken to in 12 years. "Is that it?" Maisie asked. She was looking at the town. "That's it," Lenora said. "It's smaller than I thought." "Most places are." Maisie was quiet for a moment. "Then are you scared?" Lenora considered lying. She usually didn't lie to Maisie. She had made that rule early and kept it, even when the truth was inconvenient or complicated or both. Maisie was the kind of child who could smell a lie the way some children could smell rain before it arrived, with a kind of preternatural certainty that was more unsettling than useful. "A little," Lenora said. "Not the way I used to be." "What's the difference?" "Used to be, I was scared of what people would say. Now I'm scared of what I still have to do. That's a better kind of scared." Maisie seemed to turn this over carefully. The way she turned over most things, Lenora said, not immediately accepting, but not dismissing either. She was quiet the rest of the way down the main road. The wagon wheels were loud on the packed dirt. Lenora kept her eyes forward. She had not planned on coming back this way. She had not planned on coming back at all, if she was honest with herself, which she was trying to be. But 3 weeks ago, a man had walked into her rented room above the Mason Hollow dry goods store, a room she had only just taken, only just arrived at after months of deliberate, careful planning, and he had delivered a threat so clean and so cold that it had cut through every plan she'd made and left her with exactly one path forward. Fight back or lose her daughter. That was the offer Cyrus Vale had made her, though he hadn't framed it as an offer. He never did. He framed everything as a statement of simple fact. This is how things are. This is what will happen. This is the world as I have arranged it for you. He had the particular confidence of a man who had never needed to explain himself, because the county records of Mason Hollow had always bent when he pushed them. She had taken Maisie and left that same morning, but she had not run. That was the part she needed Maisie, and eventually everyone else to understand. Run. She had gone to collect evidence. Now she was back. The road that led out toward Blackthorn Ranch split off from the main street just past the livery. Lenora turned the wagon without hesitation, which she was proud of, because inside her chest her heart was doing something complicated, and fast that had nothing to do with Cyrus Vale at all. Maisie noticed the turn. "We're not stopping in town first?" "No. Where are we going?" Lenora kept her eyes on the road ahead. The land opened up past the livery grassland and early morning sky, pale gold and wide. Kind of view that made you feel briefly, falsely infinite. "To see someone," she said. "Who?" Lenora took a breath. "Someone I should have gone to a long time ago." Gideon Blackthorn heard the wagon before he saw it. He was at the east fence, mending a break in the wire that one of his younger steers had been quietly working at for probably 2 weeks before finally pushing through. He had a bad habit of noticing things 2 weeks too late. His ranch hand Holt said it was because Gideon spent too much time looking at the paperwork and not enough time looking at the fence. Gideon thought Holt was right but would not say so, because Holt was already insufferable enough about the things he was right about. He heard the wheels on the long gravel drive. Not the sound of a supply delivery, wrong time of day, wrong rhythm. A lighter wagon. 1 horse. He straightened up, hand still wrapped around a coil of wire, and looked toward the gate. The woman driving the wagon was someone his eyes recognized before his brain caught up. There was a strange delay, like the way you sometimes hear a sound and can't identify it for a full second, only in reverse, because he knew exactly who she was, and his mind simply refused to finish the thought. Lenora Ashby. He had not spoken her name in years. Not because he'd forgotten it. You don't forget a name like that when it's been stitched into 12 years of wondering, but because somewhere along the way, he had simply stopped allowing himself the cruelty of saying it where no one could answer. She pulled the wagon to a stop 20 feet from the gate. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the passenger side of the wagon opened and a girl climbed down. 11, maybe 12. Brown coat, brown hair escaping from a poorly tied braid. She looked directly at Gideon with an expression that wasn't shy. It was the expression of a child who had learned to take people's measure before deciding how much of herself to offer them. And she had gray eyes. The kind of gray that wasn't blue and wasn't green. That was just itself the color of particular winter sky, of certain creek stones, of every mirror Gideon had looked in since he was old enough to notice his own face. He felt the coil of wire drop from his hand. "Gideon," Lenora said. Her voice was quieter than he remembered, and steadier too, which was a combination he hadn't expected. He had imagined this moment before he was human. You imagine things, and he had always imagined her voice different. Apologetic, maybe, or angry. He hadn't imagined steady. "Lenora." His own voice came out less steady than he wanted. "Climb down from the wagon." She didn't rush toward him, and she didn't hesitate. Either she walked with the kind of deliberateness that told him this was not an impulse, that she had thought through every step of the next few minutes and was committed to them. She stopped about 6 feet from him. Up close, she looked like herself and not like herself at the same time, which he supposed was what 12 years did to a person. "I know I don't have the right to just appear on your property," she said. "And I know there are things I need to explain before you have any reason to let me say anything else. But I need you to hear me out. Just let me get through it before you decide anything." Gideon looked at the girl, who was now standing slightly behind her mother, watching him. "Those are her eyes," he said. He hadn't meant to say it. It came out before he could organize his thoughts into something more rational. Lenora didn't flinch. "Yes." "How old?" 11. He did the math in the particular sick, immediate way a person does math, when the numbers are going to mean something they don't know how to hold. 12 years ago minus 9 months. His jaw tightened. "What's her name?" he asked, because he didn't know what else to ask first. "Maisie," the girl answered herself from behind her mother. Her voice was clear and not unfriendly, but carried the same assessing quality as her eyes. "I know who you are," she added. "Mama showed me a photograph." Gideon looked at Lenora. "You should come inside," he said. It was not warm. It wasn't cold either. It was just practical, and practical was what he had left. The kitchen of Blackthorn Ranch was the kind of room that told you everything about the man who lived there, not through decoration but through absence of it. The walls were bare. There were 2 chairs at the table, which meant he ate alone. The only thing on the windowsill was a rusted tin that might once have held something, and now held nothing. It was a room that worked and nothing more. Maisie sat at the table and ate the bread Gideon put in front of her without being asked, which he found both practical and quietly heartbreaking. Lenora sat across from him and folded her hands on the table and started to talk. She had clearly rehearsed this. That wasn't a criticism, he understood it. You rehearse the things you've been dreading long enough that they start to feel like a different shape in your mouth, something you can get through without choking on. She started with the letter. The letter she had received 12 years ago, in the spring of 1878, 3 weeks before they were supposed to get married. It said you'd thought it over, she said. That your family had concerns about mine, about our debts, my father's reputation. That you realized we were too different in standing and you wished me well. Her voice stayed even. It was in your handwriting, or what I thought was your handwriting. I read it probably 40 times. Gideon looked at her steadily. I received a letter too. Lenora went still. From you, he said. Said you'd met a man from Laramie, that you were grateful for our time together, but that you were going with him, and you hoped I'd understand. He paused. Your handwriting, or what I thought. The silence in the kitchen changed quality. Maisie had stopped eating. Neither of us wrote those letters, Lenora said slowly, as if saying it out loud for the first time, as if, even though she'd come here knowing this, hearing it confirmed was still a different thing entirely. No, Gideon said. I don't believe we did, Cyrus Vale. I've been trying to prove that for years, Gideon said. The flatness in his voice carried something old and worn in it. He's a careful man. County commissioner. Controls what gets filed and what gets lost. I never had enough to take to anyone. Lenora reached into the bag she'd carried in from the wagon and placed 3 things on the table. First, a folded letter, old, the paper soft with handling. Second, another, equally aged. Third, a single sheet of slightly newer paper, not a letter, more like a working draft, covered in close, neat handwriting. Gideon leaned forward. He looked at the 2 old letters first. Read them both, though he had read his own 100 times. Seeing hers beside his, on the same table, with the same morning light on them, that was different. That was the kind of different that sat in your chest and made it hard to breathe right. Then he looked at the draft. His expression changed. Where did you get this? He asked. I've been in Mason Hollow for 3 weeks, Lenora said. I took a room above the dry goods store. I came back slowly. I wanted to understand what I was dealing with before She stopped. Started again. Cyrus came to see me. He knew I was there within 2 days of my arriving, which tells you something about how much of this town he watches. He told me to leave by Sunday, or he'd file an abandonment claim against me with the county. An abandonment claim. He said the county home would take Maisie. That I'd been traveling without fixed residence under a false name. I was going by Widow Crane for years. It was safer. It wasn't. She stopped again, and for the first time her voice fractured slightly at the edge. Not a crack. More like a hairline. I did what I had to do to keep her safe. I know how that looks. I'm not judging you, Gideon said. He meant it. Judging Lenora Ashby was not in him right now. Maybe later, in the private way you sometimes judge the people you've loved, but not now and not out loud. Maisie said. She worked really hard. She always worked hard. She said it the way a child says something that is both a defense and a fact, simply, with full confidence that it should be sufficient. Gideon looked at her. At those eyes, I believe you, he said. Picked up the draft again. Studied the handwriting. Compared it to the letter he'd been given 12 years ago, the one supposedly from Lenora. The phrasing. Certain turns of phrase. This is his hand, he said. I believe so. We're at his office. He keeps records of everything, which is what makes him powerful and also what makes him vulnerable. He left me alone in the records room once, just for a few minutes. He didn't think I was worth watching closely enough, and I found it in a folio with documents from 1877 and 1878. I think it was a draft he forgot to destroy. Or he kept it deliberately, the way some men keep proof of what they've done because they're proud of it. Gideon sat back. The light through the kitchen window had shifted. It was fuller now, the kind of morning light that didn't lie. He looked at the 3 documents on his table and felt something shift in his chest that was not quite hope and not quite anger, but was in the neighborhood of both. There's more, Lenora said. She reached into the bag again. This time she produced a small cloth bundle and passed it not to Gideon but to Maisie, who had clearly been waiting for this. Maisie untied it carefully, the way you untie something you've handled many times, and laid a series of folded papers on the table beside the others. They were letters, many of them. Different paper, different dates, spanning years. Gideon picked up the first one. The handwriting was Lenora's. Gideon, she was born in November, during a snowstorm, and I don't know if you'll ever read this, but she has your eyes exactly, which I have decided to take as a kindness from the world rather than a cruelties. He stopped reading. He couldn't keep reading, and also keep his face arranged the way he needed it arranged. You mailed these to me, he said, every one of them. Different addresses, I didn't always know where you were. But I tried. Lenora's voice was measured with an effort he could see now, the control she was putting into it visible at the edges. I wrote for years. When she was born, when she said her first word. When she got sick, there was a fever, she was 4, and I wrote you because I thought. She stopped. I thought if she didn't make it, I wanted you to have known she existed. I received none of these, Gideon said, I know. He intercepted them. He had control over the mail, routing through county offices. Could have, yes. I believe so. Lenora looked at the letters spread across the table. He's been managing this for 12 years, Gideon. It wasn't just one act. He kept managing it. Every time there was a chance we might find each other, he closed the door. Maisie reached across the table and picked up one of the letters, not randomly, but with the specific familiarity of someone who had read them before. She held it for a moment, then set it down again and looked at Gideon. Mama read some of them to me, she said, when I was old enough. She said you deserved to know she'd tried. Gideon looked at the girl, at this child who had arrived on his property this morning and already turned everything he understood about the last decade inside out, and he didn't speak for a moment because there was nothing adequate to say. Then Maisie reached back into the cloth bundle and produced one more piece of paper. This one was different, newer, the paper clean, no postage marks. She handed it to Gideon without saying anything. He unfolded it. Come back to Mason Hollow, and you'll lose the child before you regain the man. No signature. Gideon read it twice, the phrasing, the coldness of it. He thought of Cyrus Vale's face, a face he had never liked, and had spent years trying to construct legitimate reasons to do something about, and felt a sharp, quiet fury settle somewhere in his sternum, like a coal that had been banked and held heat for years. When did he send this, he asked, 3 weeks ago. The morning after I arrived. And you left. And I went to get everything I needed to fight him properly. She met his eyes. I'm done being afraid of him. I'm done running. But I can't do this alone, and for the first time, she faltered. Just slightly. I need to know if you'll stand next to me. Not for my sake, for hers. Outside, somewhere in the yard, one of the horses moved in its paddock, a shuffle of hooves, a soft snort. Kitchen was very still. Gideon looked at the letters, the forged documents, at the unsigned threat, at Maisie, who was watching him with those inherited gray eyes, and the patient, careful expression of a child who had learned not to expect too much from the world and had decided to be fine with that. He didn't like that expression on her face. He didn't like it at all. He folded the unsigned threat carefully and placed it on top of the other documents. Tell me everything else you know, he said, from the beginning. Don't leave anything out. Lenora exhaled a small, barely audible breath. Not relief, not yet, but the first acknowledgement that she had made it this far. She started talking. It took 2 hours. Maisie fell asleep in the chair about halfway through, curled sideways with her coat pulled up, which Gideon noted, and filed away in the part of himself he wasn't ready to examine yet. He got up quietly at one point, found a blanket, and placed it over her without comment. Lenora noticed, but didn't say anything either. There were things between them that did not yet have language, and he suspected they wouldn't for a while, and that was appropriate. She told him about the 12 years. Not the full emotional weight of them. She was not performing her suffering for him, which he respected, but the facts of it. She had lived in 7 different towns. She had worked as a laundress, a cook, a seamstress, a school assistant in one small Wyoming settlement that had trouble keeping teachers. She had been careful about Maisie's schooling. She had been careful about everything. You never tried to come back? He asked at one point. I was ashamed, she said. Not defensively, just plainly. Your letter, the fake one, it said your family had concerns about my family's debts. I thought you'd found a reason not to want me, and the letter was just the cleanest way to say it. That's how I read it. And then when I realized I was pregnant, she paused. I didn't know how to arrive on your doorstep with that and risk being turned away twice. I wouldn't have turned you away. I know that now. I didn't know it then. Or I knew it, but I was afraid enough that the fear was louder. She looked at her hands. Fear does that. It makes itself bigger than what you actually know. Gideon didn't argue with that. He had his own 12 years of evidence about what fear could do. Cyrus is calling a public hearing, Lenora said. He filed a petition. Apparently there are questions about some of the land boundary records from your father's time, or at least he's claiming there are. He announced it publicly last week. I heard about the petition. I didn't know it was connected to you. It's connected to me, Lenora said. He wants a public stage. He's going to expose everything in that room, my years under a false name, Maisie's birth record, the father's line being blank. He's going to paint me as a fraud, who came back to claim a claim on your ranch through an illegitimate daughter. Her voice stayed even through this, though he could see what it cost. He wants to destroy my reputation so thoroughly that nothing I say after can reach anyone. He's done this before, Gideon said to others. I've been trying to document it. I know. I talked to Edwin Sutter. Gideon's eyes sharpened. You talked to Edwin. He's been watching Cyrus for years. He was afraid to say anything publicly, but I think Lenora looked up. I think if he knows someone is standing up, if he doesn't feel like he's the only one, he might be willing to speak. Edwin Sutter as a witness in a public hearing against Cyrus Vale, Gideon said slowly. He was there when those letters were handled 12 years ago. He saw something. He's carried it since then. Gideon stood up and went to the window. The yard outside was ordinary, the same fence, the same dirt, the same sky he had looked at every morning for years. He had built his life into something real and solid here, and it had always carried underneath it the unanswered question of why. Why he had bothered. What it was for. He didn't say that. He wasn't about to say that to Lenora Ashby on the first morning she'd sat in his kitchen in 12 years. He's going to come at you hard in that room, Gideon said. You know that. Yes. He's going to say things you won't want said in public. I know. And you still want to do this in the open? You could pursue the legal channels quietly, the magistrate's office, the territorial Mayans. Cyrus controls what reaches the territorial level from this county, Lenora said. You know that. A quiet filing disappears. It gets delayed, misdirected, reinterpreted. He's done it to other people. She paused. The hearing is already announced. The whole town will be there. That room is the only place where what gets said cannot be made to disappear afterward. She looked at him steadily. I'm not going to hide. I'm done hiding. But I need you next to me. He turned from the window. Maisie was still asleep in the chair, one hand tucked under her cheek, dark braids loose now across the blanket. She was breathing slowly. The expression sleep put on her face was different, younger, less guarded. Less like she'd already had to learn to take care of herself. He watched her for a moment that was probably a beat too long. All right, he said. Lenora looked at him. We go to the hearing, he said. We take everything you brought. We get Edwin there if he'll come. And we do it in the open, the way you said. He moved to the table and started stacking the documents carefully. Cyrus Vale has been managing this county through fear for long enough that people have forgotten they have the right to say something about it. You're right that the room is the place. He looked at her. But I need to know you understand what it means if it doesn't go our way. I understand. He could make this worse. He could... Gideon. Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him. I have been afraid of what he could do for 12 years. I left to stop being afraid of it. I'm not asking you to promise it will be fine. I'm asking you to stand there. He looked at her for a long moment. 31 years old and 12 years harder, and still herself, which was something he hadn't entirely expected and didn't know how to account for. I'll stand there, he said. Outside, the morning was fully arrived now, solid light, ordinary sounds, a ranch waking up to its ordinary work. But nothing in the kitchen was ordinary anymore, and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise, which was maybe the first honest thing they had managed between them in 12 years. Maisie woke up 20 minutes later and asked, with complete practicality, if there was more bread. Gideon found her some. It was not a beginning. It was too complicated, and too loaded to be called that simply. But it was something. It was a table with 3 people at it, and documents that told the truth laid out between them, and a window that let in the full morning. And for right now, that was enough to start with. Outside, on the ridge that looked down over Blackthorn Ranch, a lone rider sat his horse in the tree line and watched the wagon that should not have been there. He sat there a long time. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward town. The rider who had watched Blackthorn Ranch from the ridge that morning was named Decker Prawl, and he worked for Cyrusvale the way a hammer works for a carpenter, without conscience, without question, and with a flat, professional efficiency that made him useful and also made him dangerous. He had ridden the county lines for Cyrus for going on 6 years, and in that time he had delivered messages that weren't really messages, watched people who didn't know they were being watched, and made certain that the information Cyrus needed reached Cyrus before it reached anyone else. He was at Cyrus Vale's office on the 2nd floor of the Mason Hollow County building by 9 that morning. Cyrus was already at his desk. He was always already at his desk. Decker sometimes thought the man slept there, though he knew he didn't. Cyrus Vale lived in a large house on the north end of town with 2 servants and no family, which told you something about the particular shape of his life, if you thought about it too hard. She went to Blackthorn, Decker said. Cyrus didn't look up from what he was writing. I assumed she would. Brought a child, a girl, 11 maybe. Dark hair, gray eyes. Decker paused, looked like him. Cyrus's pen stopped, just for a moment. Then it moved again. How long were they inside, he asked. 2 hours at least. Maybe more. I didn't stay. You should have stayed. Decker said nothing. He had his own opinions about what he should and shouldn't do, and most of them he kept to himself, which was the wisest thing he did. Cyrus finally set down the pen and leaned back in his chair, and Decker watched his face do the thing it sometimes did when he was calculating, not quite expressionless but flattened. All the working moved inward where you couldn't see it. The hearing is set for Thursday, Cyrus said. 4 days. 4 days is enough. Cyrus looked at the window. Outside, Mason Hollow was beginning its morning wagons on the street, voices, the ordinary commerce of a town that did not know what was about to happen inside its county hall. She's come back to fight. She's brought the girl as what? Evidence? Sympathy? His voice carried something in it that wasn't quite contempt. More like assessment. She's smarter than I gave her credit for when she was 20. What do you want me to do? Decker asked. Cyrus looked at him. Watch the ranch. Watch who comes and goes. I need to know if she contacts Edwin Sutter. Decker kept his face arranged. Sutter. He's a weak man who has been carrying a guilty conscience for 12 years, Cyrus said. I've managed that conscience, carefully. But if she reaches him, he picked up the pen again. Watch the ranch, that's all. Don't do anything else. Decker took that to mean what it usually meant. Don't do anything else unless you have to. He nodded and left. Cyrus went back to his writing. But his pen moved differently now, less fluently, the way a man's hand moves when his thinking is somewhere else. Gideon's ranch hand, Holt Perrin, was 34 years old and had been at Blackthorn for 8 years and had, in that time, developed a comprehensive theory that Gideon Blackthorn was constitutionally incapable of accepting help from another person without making the entire process more difficult than it needed to be. He held this theory privately and shared it occasionally with the horses, who seemed to agree. He was mucking out the bay mare's stall when Gideon came into the barn that afternoon, and he could tell immediately from the particular set of Gideon's shoulders that something had shifted. Gideon always moved like he was thinking 3 things at once, which made him hard to read, but Holt had been reading him for 8 years and had gotten tolerably good at it. There's something you want to tell me, Holt said, without looking up. I need your help with something. That's new. Holt leaned the fork against the wall. What kind? Gideon told him. Not everything, not the full depth of it, but enough. The woman and the girl, the forged letters, Cyrus Vale. The hearing on Thursday. Holt listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. When Gideon finished, Holt stood for a moment and looked at the hay on the barn floor. The girl has your eyes, he said. Yes, and you believe her the woman. I believe the documents, Gideon said carefully, and I believe her. Both things. Holt nodded slowly. What do you need from me? I need you to keep the ranch running while I'm dealing with this. And I need Gideon paused in the way he paused when he was about to ask for something he didn't like asking for. I need you to go see someone in town. Carefully. Not in a way that Cyrus's people would notice. Who? Edwin Sutter, the county clerk. Holt considered this. Edwin Sutter was a small, precise man who had worked in the county records office for most of his adult life, and who had, in Holt's estimation, the specific misery of a person who knew too much and had done too little about it for too long. What do I say to him? Holt asked. Tell him that Lenora Ashby is at Blackthorn. Tell him that we have the letters, both of them, and the draft. Tell him that we're going to the hearing Thursday, regardless of whether he comes. Tell him. Gideon's jaw worked briefly. Tell him that it would be harder to do the right thing alone. He'll understand what that means. Holt picked up the fork again, not to use it, but to have something to do with his hands. And if he won't come, then he won't come, Gideon said. But give him the chance to be better than he's been. Lenora spent the afternoon at the kitchen table with all the documents spread in front of her, organizing them in the way she had organized things for 12 years methodically, without waiting for someone else to do it, because waiting for someone else was a luxury she had learned early not to rely on. Maisie sat across from her, doing the arithmetic exercises Lenora kept in a composition book for the days when there was no school available, working through them with the same slightly impatient focus she brought to anything she found too easy. Can I look at the letters again? Maisie asked. Which ones? The ones you sent him. Lenora looked up. Why? Maisie shrugged, which meant she had a reason she didn't feel like explaining. Lenora understood that. She did it herself. The ones on the left side, Lenora said. Don't unfold them more than they're already folded. Maisie reached across and picked up the stack carefully. She handled them with a kind of serious attention that made Lenora's throat tighten, not sadly exactly, but with the specific feeling of watching your child understand something you wished she'd never had to understand. You sent when I was 4, Maisie said, reading the outside of one without unfolding it. You were very sick. The fever. You said that this morning. Yes. Were you scared? Very, Lenora said simply. You had it for 4 days. I barely slept. Maisie turned the letter over in her hands. Did you think I was going to die? I didn't know. Lenora made herself not look away. I thought if you did, I wanted someone else in the world to know you had existed. That you'd been real. That you'd mattered to someone. Maisie was quiet for a while. Outside, the afternoon light was moving across the yard, long and late golden. He seems sad, Maisie said finally. Lenora didn't ask who. He is. Some. Is that our fault? It's Cyrus Vale's fault, Lenora said. Then, because Maisie deserved the fuller truth, and it's mine. A little. I could have tried harder to find out the truth. I let the shame be louder than the questions for too long. You were 20, Maisie said. She said it with the blunt, uncomplicated fairness that children sometimes managed when they weren't trying to make anyone feel better, just trying to be accurate. 20 is young. It is, Lenora agreed. But I'm 31 now. So now you're fixing it. Trying to. Maisie put the letter back on the stack and picked up her arithmetic book again. Then she said, without looking up, I think he would have liked knowing me. Lenora's hands went still on the papers in front of her. I think so too, she said quietly. Maisie nodded once, as if that settled something, and went back to her arithmetic. Edwin Sutter came to Blackthorn Ranch the following morning. He came alone, and he came early. Before the roads were busy enough for anyone to take particular notice of a county clerk riding out toward the eastern ranches, on what could reasonably be framed as official business if anyone asked. He was a thin man with careful hands, and the habit of touching things lightly, as if he were always slightly afraid of leaving fingerprints. Gideon brought him inside and put coffee in front of him, and Edwin held the cup in both hands and did not immediately drink from it. Lenora was at the table already. She had the documents organized in the order she'd established the afternoon before. She didn't say anything when Edwin came in, just looked at him with the particular steadiness she had been using for 2 days now, like a woman who had made her decision and was done second-guessing it. Edwin looked at her and looked away, and then looked back. You're taller than I remembered, he said, which was a strange thing to say, but people said strange things when they were nervous. You remember me? She asked. I was at the records office when you came in with your father once. You were maybe 17. You were getting a deed verified. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. And I knew you were with Gideon Blackthorn. Everyone knew. He stopped. It was a long time ago. 12 years, Lenora said. Yes. Edwin looked down at the table. His hands were very still now. 12 years is a long time to carry something. What did you see? Gideon asked. He kept his voice neutral, but Lenora could hear underneath it the thing that had been building in him for days, not impatience exactly. More like the particular tension of a man who had been waiting for an answer to a question long enough that he'd almost stopped believing the answer existed. Edwin set the coffee cup down. He did not look at either of them. It was the spring of 1878, he said. March or April. I was working late. There was a filing backlog. Cyrus kept me late sometimes to work through them. He came in around 7 in the evening. Thought I'd left. I was behind the large filing case in the back room. He paused. He had 2 letters. He read them both. I could see him from where I was, though he couldn't see me. He folded them very carefully and put them into a leather folio that he kept in the bottom drawer of his private cabinet. You saw the letters themselves? Lenora asked. I saw the envelopes. One had your name on it. One had Gideon's. He swallowed. I didn't understand at the time what I was seeing. I understood later. By then it was he stopped again. Jaw tightened. By then you were gone, and he was Cyrus Vale. And I was a clerk with a county salary, and no proof of anything, and he was the man who decided whether my position continued. You were afraid, Gideon said. I was afraid, Edwin said. And he said it without any of the language of excuse, just the flat, humiliated admission of a man stating a fact he wished were otherwise. I've been afraid of him for 12 years, and I've known for 12 years what my fear cost the 2 of you, and he pressed his lips together. Sorry, that is not sufficient. I understand that it is not sufficient, but I am. Lenora looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Would you testify to what you saw in the hearing on Thursday? Edwin picked up the coffee cup again, drank from it this time. Set it down. That's why I'm here, he said. I'm not a brave man. But I'm done letting my cowardice be someone else's disaster. He looked at the documents on the table. Are those the letters? In a handwritten draft we believe is Vale's, Gideon said. The phrasing matches. Edwin leaned forward and looked at the draft without touching it. He studied it for a long moment, and something in his face shifted a kind of recognition, then a kind of decision. He wrote with a particular habit, Edwin said quietly. See this construction here, inasmuch as circumstances preclude. He used it in internal memos. I've seen it hundreds of times. He looked up. I can testify to that. The handwriting, the phrasing. I've read his hand for 12 years. I know it. Gideon looked at Lenora. Lenora was looking at Edwin Sutter with an expression that was not gratitude exactly, or not only that. It was more complicated. The expression of someone watching a door open that had been closed. For so long they had restructured their entire life around it being closed. We'll need to get to the mail ledgers, Gideon said. If there's any record of the letters being routed through counties. I can access the ledgers, Edwin said. I've been the clerk for 12 years. It's my office as much as his. More, technically, since he's commissioner and I'm the keeper of record. He said this with a small, precise dignity that hadn't been there when he first sat down. I'll find what I can before Thursday, and I'll be in that room when it opens. They sat at the table for another hour. Gideon went through everything they had, piece by piece, and Edwin confirmed or questioned each element with the careful, methodical attention of a man who had spent his professional life in the architecture of paper. It was dry work in some ways, legal and organizational, but underneath it was 12 years of Lenora's life being reconstructed from documents, and that was not dry at all. Maisie came in partway through and assessed Edwin Sutter with her customary directness. Are you the one who knew and didn't say anything? She asked. Edwin looked at her. A complicated expression moved across his face. Yes, he said. I am. Maisie considered him. Are you going to say something now? I am, she nodded once. Okay, she said, and went back outside, and that was all. Edwin watched her go. She has his eyes, he said quietly, almost to himself. Yes, Lenora said. Edwin was quiet a moment. Then he turned back to the documents and got back to work. That evening, after Edwin left and Maisie was asleep, Gideon found Lenora standing outside by the east fence, looking at nothing in particular. The night was clear and the temperature had dropped fast the way it did in early spring, that whip change from tolerable to cold that caught you if you weren't paying attention. He brought her coat, because she hadn't brought one out, and handed it to her without comment. She took it the same way, without comment, without making anything of it. They stood there for a minute, not talking. "You doing all right?" he asked finally. "I don't know," she said, which was honest. "I've been running toward this for weeks, and now that it's almost here, I keep second-guessing the pieces." Which pieces? Whether Edwin will hold when Cyrus looks at him directly. Whether the draft is clear enough. Whether she stopped. Whether I can stand in that room and have everything said about me in public, and not— She didn't finish it. "Fall apart," Gideon said. "I was going to say lose my nerve." "Different things." Slightly. She pulled the coat around her. "I've done hard things before. I know I have. But most of the hard things I've done without anyone watching. There's something different about being seen when you're struggling." Gideon thought about that. He had spent 12 years becoming a man who managed his own life in the most private way possible, because the alternative needing people, being seen by people, having his struggles visible had always felt like the kind of vulnerability that cost too much. He was not going to say that to her, but he thought it. "You're not going to be alone in there," he said instead. "I know. And whatever he says about you, about where you've been, the name you used, any of it, none of it is the shape of you. People in that room are going to figure that out." "You can't promise that," she said. "No, but I think it's true anyway." She looked at him sidelong. In the dark, without the full day's business between them, she looked more the way he remembered her, or maybe not exactly remembered, because memory is unreliable and 12 years is a long time, but something close. "I am sorry," she said quietly, "for thinking the letter was real. I should have come to you." "You were 20, he said, which was the same thing Maisie had said, and made him feel strange to say it, but it was true. "I should have trusted what I knew. Maybe. I also should have come looking." His voice was flat in the way it got when he was being honest about something he'd rather not be honest about. "I got that letter and I closed around it. I didn't fight it. I figured I'd been a fool to think I deserved what I had, and I let that be the answer." He paused. "That's the part that belongs to me." Lenora didn't say anything for a moment. "We were both 20, she said. "We were." Another silence. A different kind, less weighted than the silences of that first morning. "How is she?" Gideon asked. "Maisie, actually. Not what you'd tell a stranger." Lenora thought about it honestly. "Steadier than she should be," she said. "She's always been like that. Not because she wasn't scared sometimes, but because she decided early that being scared wasn't going to be her main thing. I don't know where she got that." Gideon said nothing. "She asked me once," Lenora continued, "if you knew about her. She was about 7. I told her I'd tried to tell you, and that you hadn't received the letters. She thought about that for probably 2 minutes, and then said, so he didn't know he was supposed to be sad. And that was all she said about it." She shook her head slightly. "She's a strange kid. I mean that well. She looks you directly in the eye when she's deciding whether to trust you," Gideon said. "Yes, she does. Figured that out this morning. It takes some people longer." Lenora paused. "She likes you. She hasn't said so, but she hasn't not said so, which in Maisie means she's still figuring it out but leaning toward it." Gideon absorbed this. He wasn't sure what to do with it, but he absorbed it. "Put together a cot in the back storage room," he said. "If you and Maisie want to stay here through Thursday, it's better than the ride back to town and dealing with mites." "Yes," Lenora said. "Thank you. It's not a proper guest room," he said. "Cot is, it's not." Gideon. Her voice was quiet but direct. "I have slept on worse things than your storage room cot for the last 11 years. I'm not fragile about furniture." He almost smiled. It happened before he stopped it. "Right," he said. She looked at him, and he looked away, and neither of them addressed it. Inside the house, Maisie slept with her little cloth bundle tucked beside her on the cot, all the letters inside it. She had reorganized them herself that evening, into what she explained was chronological order, because she said, if they were going to be evidence, they should be in order. Nobody had asked her to do this. She had done it because it needed doing, and she was the one who noticed. She was, Gideon had thought, watching her, an unusual child. He was still thinking about it, standing at the east fence in the dark. The next 2 days moved with a specific, grinding quality of preparation for something large, not slow exactly, but dense, every hour packed with things that needed doing and decisions that needed making. Gideon spent most of Wednesday at his desk, writing out a formal account of the forged letters, the 12 years of intercepted correspondence, and Cyrus Vale's pattern of records manipulation, citing every specific document by date and description. Edwin had sent word through Holt that he'd found entries in the mail ledger's specific months in 1878 through 1882, where correspondence addressed to Blackthorn Ranch had been logged at the county relay point and then had no further record of delivery. Not proof alone, but another thread in a pattern that was becoming harder to dismiss. Lenora went through her own account with the same methodical care. She wrote it out twice, once roughly, then again with corrections. She was precise about dates and places and the sequence of events, because precision was what you needed when you were a woman whose word was going to be challenged by a powerful man in a room full of people who had known him longer than they'd known her. She was also quietly dreading it. She didn't say this to Gideon. She was not ready to be that specific with him yet. But she felt it, the particular, low dread of knowing that Thursday morning was coming, regardless of how she spent Wednesday, that Cyrus Vale would stand in that county hall with 12 years of local credibility and money and influence, and she would stand there with documents and an 11-year-old girl and a man she hadn't spoken to in over a decade and one scared county clerk. It was not a comfortable inventory. Maisie found her at the desk late Wednesday afternoon, sitting with her pencil not moving, not writing anything. "You're doing the staring thing," Maisie said. "What staring thing?" "Where you look at something, but you're not seeing it. You do it when you're scared." Lenora looked at her daughter. "I thought we agreed you were going to work on the arithmetic." "I finished the arithmetic." Maisie pulled the other chair over and sat in it. "Are you worried about tomorrow?" "A little. What's the worst thing that could happen?" Lenora considered lying. Didn't. He could make the room believe him instead of us. Maisie was quiet, thinking about this with the same unhurried attention she brought to things she found genuinely difficult. "What happens then?" she asked. "Then we find another way." Lenora's voice was steadier saying it than she felt. "We always find another way. That's the thing about Cyrus Vale. He keeps thinking he can end things, and he can make things very hard, but he's never actually been able to end something we decided to keep going." "Like me," Maisie said, not sadly, just as a factual example. Lenora looked at her and felt the particular fierce pull in her chest that she had felt since the first moment she'd held this child, that specific love that had no adequate language for it. That was not warm and soft the way people made it sound, but was instead something structural, something load-bearing, something that had kept her vertical on her worst nights just by existing. "Like you," she said. Maisie nodded. She seemed satisfied with this. "I'm going to say something tomorrow," she said, "in the hearing. I've been thinking about what I want to say. Maisie minus. Not a long thing, just something short." She met her mother's eyes with the full, clear-eyed directness that Lenora had stopped being surprised by years ago. "I know what happened because of him. I should be able to say so." Lenora looked at her daughter for a long moment. At this 11-year-old person who had, without fanfare or dramatics, decided to stand up in a public room and say the true thing because it needed saying. "All right," she said. "You're not going to tell me it's too dangerous?" "It might be unpleasant." "I know unpleasant," Maisie said. "Yes," Lenora said, "you do." The evening came down around the ranch slowly. Holt made a simple supper, and they all ate it at the big table. Holt at one end with his habitual quietness, Maisie across from Gideon talking about the mare in the paddock, who had an interesting way of flicking her left ear, Gideon answering in the precise, undemonstrative way he had about things he actually knew, Lenora eating and listening and watching all of it. It was an improbable arrangement. Strange and awkward, and too much history underneath it, and not enough of any of them knowing how to be around each other yet. Nobody pretended otherwise. But Maisie ate everything on her plate and asked if there was more, and Holt passed the bread without being asked, and Gideon refilled the water without comment, and it was not a family and it was not nothing. And outside the evening deepened into night, and Thursday came quietly closer. In his office across town, Cyrus Vale sat alone and read through what he planned to say in the morning. And he was thorough and he was prepared, and he had done this before, and it had always worked, and he was not afraid. He should have been. Thursday arrived the way bad days often do, quietly, without announcement, the sky a flat pale gray that offered neither the drama of storm nor the reassurance of clear light. Just ordinary morning pressing down on everything, indifferent to what was about to happen inside the county hall. Gideon was up before anyone. Lenora heard him moving in the kitchen around 5, the particular careful quiet of a person trying not to wake the house, and she lay on the storage room cot for another 20 minutes not sleeping, staring at the low ceiling and running through the sequence of the morning the way she had been running through it for 3 days. The documents in their order, Edwin and what he'd say, the mail ledger entries, the draft in Cyrus's hand with its specific damning phrasing. She had organized and reorganized these elements until she could recite them in the dark, which she now could, which did not make her feel as ready as she had hoped it would. Maisie was already awake when Lenora came out of the storage room. She was sitting at the kitchen table, in her coat, fully dressed, boots on, cloth bundle in her lap, like someone who had been ready for some time and was simply waiting for the rest of them to catch up. Gideon looked at the girl and then at Lenora. "She's been like that since I came in," he said quietly. "She does that," Lenora said. "When she's decided about something, she gets ready and then she waits. She doesn't pace, she doesn't fidget, she just waits." Gideon considered Maisie for a moment, with an expression that was not quite readable. Then he set a plate of bread and cold bacon on the table in front of her. "Eat something," he said. "It's going to be a long morning." Maisie looked at the plate and looked at him. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "Yes," he said, which appeared to surprise her slightly. She had probably expected him to deny it, the way adults usually did. "Me too," she said. Then she picked up the bread and ate it. They left the ranch at 7. Holt stayed behind to manage the stock, but he stood at the fence as they went and watched them go, with the particular expression of a man who didn't know how to say good luck without it coming out wrong. So he said nothing and lifted his hand once. The road into Mason Hollow took 40 minutes. Nobody talked much. The air was cold, and the wagon moved at its steady pace, and the town came into view the way it always came into view. From the eastern approach, the water tower first, then the roof lines, then the street itself opening up. Lenora watched it come closer and felt her chest tighten in a way she refused to accommodate. She had been afraid of this town for 12 years. She was done paying that particular tax. She sat straight on the wagon bench and kept her eyes forward and did not allow herself to look away. County Hall was already filling when they arrived. This was not a surprise. Cyrus Vale had made sure the hearing was publicly announced, which had seemed like overconfidence on his part, but was actually strategy. He wanted the room full. He wanted witnesses to what he planned to do to Lenora's credibility. He had done this before, with others called public proceedings, and used them as theaters for his particular brand of managed destruction, where the appearance of due process gave him cover for something that was really just power asserting itself in front of an audience. What he had not accounted for was that a full room worked in both directions. Gideon pulled the wagon up on the side street, and they walked the half-block to the hall entrance. People noticed. Of course they did. Mason Hollow was not a large town, and Gideon Blackthorn was a known figure in it, and the woman walking beside him was not known, but was clearly not local. And the girl between them, with the straight spine and the gray eyes, was noticed by several people who then looked at Gideon, and looked again with the specific expression of people doing involuntary arithmetic. Nobody said anything directly, but the looking happened. Inside, the hall smelled of sawdust and too many bodies in an enclosed space. The benches were filling fast ranchers, merchants, the woman who ran the boarding house on Coulter Street, the barber, 2 of the county road crew, a handful of faces Lenora didn't recognize, and a handful she did. She looked for Edwin Sutter and found him near the front, seated alone on the end of a bench, his hands folded in his lap, and his face arranged in the careful blankness of a man, concentrating on not looking as frightened as he was. Their eyes met. She gave him a small nod. He nodded back. His jaw was tight. Cyrus Vale was already at the front table, seated, papers arranged before him, with the deliberate neatness of a man who knew exactly the impression he was making. He was in his good coat, dark wool, well cut, the coat of a county official who understood that authority was partly costume. He did not look up when Gideon and Lenora entered. Not looking up was itself a choice, a small performance of not being concerned. Gideon steered them to seats near the front on the opposite side from Edwin. Lenora sat down. Maisie sat beside her. Gideon sat on Lenora's other side, and the three of them arranged themselves with the deliberate calm of people who had decided the room was not going to rattle them, even though the room was absolutely trying to. County hearing officer, a man named Aldous Harp, who had been running these proceedings for 20 years with the weary competence of a man deeply tired of other people's disputes, called the room to order at 8:30. He was not a dramatic man. He read the formal description of the hearing, a land boundary inquiry, combined with a matter of public record and identification in the same flat tone he used for everything, which was the tone of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by what human beings did to each other over property and paperwork. Then he looked up. "Mr. Vale, you called this proceeding. You have the floor first." Cyrus Vale stood. He was good at rooms. That was the honest assessment. He was genuinely skilled at standing in front of people and making them believe that what he said was simply what was true, delivered by someone who had no personal stake in it. His voice was measured and regretful in tone, the voice of a man reluctantly performing an unpleasant duty. "Thank you, Aldous," he said, as if they were friends, as if this were casual. "I want to start by acknowledging that what I have to present this morning is not comfortable for anyone. That is not my intention. My intention as county commissioner is simply the integrity of our public record, a record that several recent arrivals to Mason Hollow appear to be attempting to manipulate." He paused. Let that land. Then he looked directly at Lenora. "This woman," he said, "arrived in Mason Hollow 3 weeks ago under, by her own history, at least one false name. She has been traveling the frontier for 11 years representing herself as a widow, a status she has no documentation to support because she is not a widow. She is an unmarried woman who bore a child outside of any legal or documented union, and has apparently chosen to return to this county to press some manner of claim through that child against one of our most established ranching families." The room stirred. Not loudly, more like a field when the wind changes, everything moving slightly in the same direction. Gideon's jaw tightened. Lenora put one hand flat on her knee and kept her face still. "Furthermore," Cyrus continued, "the land boundary questions raised in this proceeding touch on records from the Blackthorn Ranch that date to the elder Blackthorn's original filing records, that this woman, if allowed to establish any legal connection to the Blackthorn family through her daughter, could use to press claim that would affect water rights currently shared by 3 neighboring operations." He spread his hands in a gesture of regret. "I want to be fair. I want to be fair to everyone in this room. But fairness requires that we look at the full picture of what is actually happening here." He sat down. Aldous Harp looked at Gideon, Mr. Blackthorn. Fonts, Gideon stood. He was not as polished as Cyrus. He knew that, and he didn't try to compensate for it by performing a smoothness he didn't have. He stood and he spoke the way he did everything directly, without decoration, with the specific economy of a man who knew the difference between what mattered and what was noise. "My name is Gideon Blackthorn," he said. "I've ranched the eastern section of this county for 15 years. Most of you know me. I think most of you also know that I don't come into public proceedings without a reason." He reached into the document folio on the bench beside him. "In 1878, I was engaged to marry Lenora Ashby. 3 weeks before our wedding, I received a letter supposedly from her, informing me that she had met someone else and was leaving Mason Hollow." He held up the letter. "I have that letter here. I have had it for 12 years. He paused. "Problem is that Lenora Ashby did not write it." The room went quieter than it had been. At the same time, Gideon continued, "Miss Ashby received a letter supposedly from me, informing her that my family had concerns about hers, and that I was ending our engagement." He held up the second letter. "She has carried that letter for 12 years as well." He set them both on the table in front of Aldous Harp. "Neither of us wrote the letters the other received. We believe they were forged, and we believe we can demonstrate by whom." Cyrus Vale's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted a very small tightening, like a man making himself still. That is a serious accusation, Aldous Harpsa said. Yes, Gideon said. It is. I also have this. He placed the draft on the table. A handwritten document that we recovered from a county records file from 1877 through 1878. The handwriting and the specific phrasing match the forged letters. I am prepared to have these compared by anyone in this room who knows what they're looking at. He sat down. Cyrus was on his feet before Aldous could speak. I'd like to know, Cyrus said, his voice carrying the precise temperature of controlled anger, not hot, but not entirely controlled either, how documents from county records files come to be in the private possession of a rancher. That is itself a records violation. The document was in a public folio, Lenora said. She had not stood. She said it from her seat, clearly, without raising her voice above conversational level. Several people turned to look at her. Aldous Harp raised his hand for quiet. Miss Ashby, you'll have your time. Mr. Vale, the question of how the document was obtained is secondary to the question of what it contains. If you'd like to challenge its authenticity, do so. Cyrus sat back down. His face was still arranged correctly, but Lenora could see, because she had been watching him for 3 weeks, with the specific attention of someone whose survival depended on understanding how he operated, that something had shifted in him. He had not expected the draft. He had thought about the letters, had prepared for the letters. The draft was something else. Good, she thought. Aldous called Lenora forward 20 minutes into the proceeding. She stood. She walked to the front of the room. She was aware of every set of eyes in that space following her, and she did not allow this awareness to become anything other than information. She had rehearsed this. She had prepared for it. But she had also decided, sometime in the dark hours of Wednesday night, that the prepared version was not the only version she was going to give. The prepared version covered the facts. The facts needed covering. But she was not going to stand in this room in front of these people and give them only the facts, because the facts without the rest of it were a skeleton, without anything that made it a person. And Cyrus Vale was counting on her to present herself as a legal matter rather than a human being. She was going to disappoint him. She started with the facts. She was precise, and she was organized, and she moved through the timeline in the order she had prepared it: the engagement, the letter, the reason she left, the pregnancy discovered alone in a town 3 counties away, the decision to travel under a different name, because an unmarried pregnant woman in 1879 was a specific kind of vulnerable that people who had not been one could not fully understand. Then she stopped. She looked at the room, at the faces, some neutral, some already skeptical in the way people get when they have decided something before the evidence finishes arriving. Some waiting, some in the back rows, carrying expressions she could not fully read. I am not going to ask this room to feel sorry for me, she said. That is not what I came for. Her voice was steady, and it was not cold, it was something in between. The voice of a woman who had made her peace with being seen and had decided to be seen completely. I made choices in the last 12 years that I am not proud of. I lived under a false name. I allowed people to believe I was a widow. I am not proud of that, and I am not going to pretend I am. She paused. But I am going to tell you why I did it, in plain language, because I think plain language is what this room deserves. She told them, not the summary version. The real version, the exhaustion of moving from town to town, the specific calculations a woman alone with a child made every day about which truths were safe to tell and which ones would get her door closed in her face, or worse. The winters when the money ran out before the month did. The boarding houses with thin walls and landlords who had opinions about unmarried women. The time she had been sick, and Maisie had been sick, and there was no one to call and no one to ask, because asking meant explaining, and explaining meant exposure. She did not perform this. She reported it, and the room, which had come in already tilted toward Cyrus Vale, by 12 years of familiarity with his version of things, went very quiet. Cyrus leaned forward. If I may, you'll have your response, Aldous said flatly. Let her finish. Lenora looked at Cyrus directly. She had not done this, yet had looked slightly past him or at other parts of the room, partly because she knew that looking directly at him would cost her something, and she was budgeting her composure carefully. But she looked at him now, and he looked back at her with the careful assessing blankness that was his version of a poker face. "You told me to leave by Sunday," she said, to him and to the room at the same time. "You came into my room with a key that was not yours to carry, at 6 in the morning, and you told me to take my daughter and leave, or you would file an abandonment claim against me." She did not raise her voice. "You did this because you knew I was here. You knew within 2 days of my arriving, which tells this room something about how much of this county you believe you have the right to watch." She looked back at Aldous. "I did not leave. I went to collect what I needed to be here today. And here I am." She sat down. The room was not quiet in the way it had been quiet for Cyrus. It was a different quality of quiet, the kind that comes when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, that has changed the air in a room and everyone knows it, but nobody has yet decided what to do about it. Maisie reached over and took Lenora's hand under the table. Lenora held it. She did not look at her daughter. Cyrus came back harder. She had expected that. You didn't deal with a man like Cyrus Vale for 3 weeks without understanding that his first response to being hit was to hit back at twice the force and in a direction you hadn't anticipated. He stood again, and he was no longer performing reluctance that had dropped, replaced by something more direct, more aggressive, and in some ways more honest. "This is a very affecting story," he said. "I don't doubt that this woman has had a difficult life. Difficult lives are not rare in this territory. What I question, what I think this room should question, is whether any of what she has presented constitutes evidence of anything beyond her own choices." He turned to the table where the documents lay. 2 old letters that she has been in possession of for 12 years. A handwritten draft, she claims, was found in county files, under circumstances she cannot fully document, by a woman who was in those files without authorization. He looked at Gideon. "And a rancher who has decided, for reasons that are perhaps not entirely objective, to support her claims." "The handwriting," Gideon said. "Anyone can make a claim about handwriting," Cyrus said, spreading his hands. "I have written thousands of documents in this office over 15 years. If you pull enough of them, you can find phrases that appear in multiple contexts. That is not evidence of forgery. That is simply evidence of how language works when one person uses it consistently." It was a good argument. Lenora recognized it as a good argument, which made it worse. Aldous Harp was frowning at the documents. "Is there any witness to the original handling of these letters? Beyond the parties involved?" This was the moment. Lenora looked at Edwin Sutter. Edwin was already standing. He did it without being called. He stood up from his bench near the front, and he did not wait for Aldous to invite him, because if he waited, he was afraid he would reconsider, and he had been reconsidering things for 12 years. And was not going to do it anymore. "I'm Edwin Sutter," he said. "I've been the county records clerk for 14 years. I have something to say." Cyrus Vale's body went very still. Aldous looked at Edwin with the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of the morning. "Go ahead, Mr. Sutter." Edwin stood the way uncomfortable men stand when they have decided to be honest, not easily, not gracefully, but with a kind of rigid determination that was its own kind of courage. "In the spring of 1878, he said, and his voice was not as steady as Lenora's had been, and not as measured as Gideon's, but it was audible and it did not stop. "I was working late in the records office. Mr. Vale came in, believing himself to be alone. I was behind the main filing case. I witnessed him reading 2 letters. The envelopes were addressed, one to Miss Lenora Ashby, one to Mr. Gideon Blackthorn. He then placed them in a personal folio in his private cabinet." Edwin paused. "I understood at the time that I had seen something I was not supposed to see. I did not understand fully what I had seen until afterward, until she left town and the engagement was publicly dissolved." He stopped. "I was afraid to speak. I have been afraid to speak for 12 years. I am speaking now." The room broke open, not dramatically, not shouting or commotion, but in the way a room breaks when the thing everyone has been sitting carefully around finally comes into the air. People leaning to their neighbors. A low murmur that Aldous let run for about 15 seconds before he brought the room back. Cyrus Vale had not moved. He had not moved in a way that was itself movement, a deliberate, visible stillness that Lenora read immediately as a man recalculating, not panicking, which meant he was not done yet. Edwin Sutter, Cyrus said, and his voice carried the full of weight 14 years of professional relationship and the specific contempt of a man for a subordinate who has just betrayed him, has struggled with his position in this office for years. I have managed that difficulty with patience. What he is describing is a misunderstanding of something routine intercepted mail that was being held for legal reasons related to a separate county matter that was resolved. Which matter? Aldous said. Cyrus paused one beat. I would need to review the records. You are the county commissioner, Aldous said. You have been for 15 years. You don't remember the specific legal matter that caused you to personally hold personal correspondence addressed to 2 private citizens? Another pause, this one slightly longer. It was a long time ago, Cyrus said. The room heard that. The room heard it in the way rooms hear things when the wrong person says the wrong thing at the wrong moment, with a collective, unspoken shift that was not quite judgment yet, but was the thing that precedes it. Lenora leaned slightly toward Gideon. The mail ledger, she said quietly. Gideon stood. I'd like to enter additional documentation, he said to Aldous. County mail relay ledgers from 1,878 through 1,882, showing correspondence addressed to Blackthorn Ranch, logged at the county relay point, with no subsequent delivery record. Aldous looked at Edwin. Mr. Sutter, are these county documents? They are, Edwin said. I retrieved them from the archive this morning. They are official county records. Aldous held out his hand. Gideon brought them forward. Cyrus was on his feet again. The interpretation of relay ledgers requires context. Context, Aldous said, not looking up from the ledger pages, appears to be that a significant number of letters addressed to a private citizen were logged and not delivered over a period of 4 years. He looked up. That is the context, Mr. Vale. Would you like to provide a different one? Cyrus said nothing. It was the first time, in Lenora's 3 weeks of watching him, that Cyrus Vale said nothing when speaking would have been the useful option. She filed this away. Silence in a man who always had an answer was its own kind of answer. That was when Maisie stood up. Lenora did not tell her to. She did not have time to stop her. Maisie simply stood, with the particular quiet decisiveness she brought to everything she had decided, and she looked at Aldous Harp and said, clearly enough for the back row to hear her, "Can I say something?" The room went completely still. Aldous Harp looked at this 11-year-old girl, standing at the bench with her cloth bundle under her arm and her gray eyes and her straight spine. And he appeared to do the same involuntary arithmetic several other people in the room had already done. And his expression shifted in the way. Expressions shift when a person is confronted by something they hadn't included in their expectations for the morning. How old are you? He asked. 11, Maisie said. Almost 12. This is not, Cyrus began. I didn't ask you, Aldous said mildly but completely. He looked at Maisie. Go ahead. Maisie did not look at her mother, and she did not look at Gideon. She looked at the room, at all of it, the full room, the faces turned toward her. I know you're all looking at me, she said, because of my eyes. I've noticed that's been happening since we walked in. I have his eyes. She did not gesture toward Gideon. She didn't need to. I don't know county law. I'm 11. But I know what happened to my family because of what that man did. She looked at Cyrus Vale directly, with the same clear, unafraid directness she had turned on Edwin Sutter when she asked him if he was going to say something now. My mama worked every day I can remember. She washed other people's clothes and cooked for strangers, and sometimes we didn't have enough, and she didn't eat so I could. She did all of that because she was afraid, not because she was dishonest. She was afraid because he made her afraid. She paused. She was not performing. She was reporting the way her mother had reported, with the precision of someone who had organized their facts and was delivering them cleanly. Mr. Vale didn't do what he did because he thought my father wasn't good enough. He did it because he wanted to win something. And he used 2 people who loved each other to do it. And then he used me before I was even born as part of how he kept winning. She stopped. I don't know what the law says about any of this. But I know the difference between someone who lied to survive and someone who lied to win. And so does everybody in this room, if they're honest. She sat down. The silence lasted a very long time. Gideon had his hand pressed flat on the bench beside him and was looking at the floor, and his jaw was working in the way it did when he was holding something very tightly inside himself. Lenora was looking at her daughter, and Maisie was sitting with her cloth bundle in her lap and her spine straight and her face arranged in its customary patient calm, as if she had simply said what needed saying and was done with it now. In the back of the room, someone started to speak to their neighbor. Then someone else. The murmur came back up, but this time it wasn't the murmur of people adjusting to new information. It was people who had already adjusted and were now telling each other what they had decided. Aldous Harp looked at Cyrus Vale. "Do you have a response to?" he began. "She is a child," Cyrus said. "She is repeating what she has been coached to say." "Nobody coached me," Maisie said from her bench, not loud. Not angry, just accurate. Several people in the room laughed. Not cruelly, it was the laugh of people releasing something. Cyrus turned on them, and the room felt it, the shift from managed authority to actual anger, and that shift was visible. And visible anger in a man who had built his power on the appearance of calm was a different thing entirely than anything he'd said in the last 2 hours. It was the thing that made people reassess. It was the thing that made a room remember that it had a choice. "You are being manipulated," Cyrus said, his voice losing its careful modulation, the edges of it sharpening. "All of you. You are sitting here in this room letting a woman with a documented history of deception, and a child who has been put up to this, and a rancher who has clearly lost all objectivity, convince you that I, who have managed this county's records with integrity for 15 years, have done something criminal. Based on what? Old letters. A draft that could have been written by anyone. A clerk who has been derelict in his own duties for years making accusations because he is afraid of the audit I have been planning for his section of." "Cyrus," Aldous Harp said. Cyrus stopped. Aldous was looking at him with the expression of a man who has been patient with the proceedings for 2 hours and has now arrived at a conclusion he did not entirely expect to reach. "Sit down," Aldous said, the 2 words flat, unhurried, carrying in them the full weight of 20 years of running these proceedings and the specific authority of a man who does not need to perform authority because he actually has it. Cyrus sat down. His face was still arranged. But the arrangement was showing its seams now, the control that required too much effort, the composure that was costing too much to maintain. And the room could see it. Rooms see everything, eventually. That is what rooms are for. Aldous Harp set down the ledger pages he had been holding and looked at the documents laid out before him, both forged letters, the handwritten draft, the mail ledger entries, arranged in the quiet, damning order that Lenora had organized them into, and he was quiet for a long moment. "I'm going to take a recess," he said. 1 hour. When we return, I want to hear from anyone else in this room who has relevant information about the county records practices this proceeding has raised." He paused. "And I want a territorial magistrate contacted. Today." He looked at his clerk, a young man near the door who had been writing furiously for 2 hours. "Send the wire before the hour is out." Cyrus Vale stood. "Aldous, I must object to your objection is noted," Aldous said. He was already gathering papers. 1 hour, everyone. The room went into motion, benches scraping, voices rising, people standing. The particular organized chaos of a crowd that had been sitting still through something large and was now processing it. Lenora sat for a moment without moving. Gideon's hand found the table near hers, not touching, but close. Maisie tugged on Lenora's sleeve. "Did that go well?" she whispered. "I think so," Lenora said carefully. "I think so." Cyrus looked angry, Maisie said. "He was. Is that good?" Lenora looked across the room to where Cyrus Vale was seated alone now, his careful papers arranged in front of him, the room that had always been his room moving around him, without the deference it had walked in with. He was looking at the table, not at her, not at anyone. "Yes," she said, "for us that's good." But as the recess hour began and the room emptied, and Gideon moved to speak with Edwin, and Maisie stayed close at Lenora's side, Cyrus Vale sat very still at his table, and his eyes moved once to the door, not longingly, not yet, but with the beginning of the calculation that a man makes when the room he built is coming down around him, and he is starting to understand that the only question left is how it ends. Lenora saw it. She looked away before he could see her looking. 1 hour, she told herself. 1 hour and then back into it. Could do 1 more hour. She had done harder things than 1 more hour. The recess hour did not feel like an hour. It felt like the particular compressed time of a person waiting for something they cannot control, where every minute has too much in it and also not enough, and the mind keeps running the same calculations over and over, as if repetition might produce a different answer. Lenora took Maisie outside, not far just to the side street beside the county hall, where the air was cold and the noise from inside was muffled, and there was enough space to breathe without being watched. Maisie stood beside her without fidgeting, which was one of the things about Maisie that Lenora had always found both reassuring and quietly unnerving. Other children fidgeted. Maisie went still when she was thinking hard, like a pond that goes flat before a storm. "Are you all right?" Lenora asked. "Yes," Maisie said. "Then my hands were shaking when I stood up. Did you see?" No, they were. She looked at them now, held loosely at her sides. "They stopped after I started talking. That's usually how it works." "Is that true for you too?" Lenora thought about standing at the front of that room, the full weight of every set of eyes in it pressing on her. "Yes," she said. "The worst part is before." Maisie nodded slowly, storing this. Gideon came around the corner of the building with Edwin Sutter beside him, and they were talking in the low, quick way of people covering ground fast. Edwin looked like a man who had put down something very heavy and was still figuring out how his body felt without the weight not light exactly, more like uncertain. Like he didn't quite know his own dimensions anymore. "There are others," Gideon said when he reached them. Kept his voice down, inside. 3 people who came up to Edwin during the recess. A widow named Caswell, she lost a water rights filing 6 years ago. Disappeared in county records after she disputed Cyrus's survey of her lower boundary. And 2 ranchers from the north section who had boundary filings delayed until their window for appeal expired. Lenora looked at Edwin. "Did you know about these?" Edwin's expression was complicated. "I knew things were wrong," he said. "I didn't know the specific cases. He kept me away from anything that touched on his personal. I had my section of the office and he had his, and I told myself that was just how offices worked." He stopped. "That's not an excuse. I'm not offering it as one." "Are they willing to speak?" Lenora asked. "The widow Caswell is." Gideon ran a hand along the back of his neck. "The ranchers are less certain. They're afraid of what happens after. If Cyrus walks out of that room still in his position, what it means for them." "It's fair," Lenora said. "That's not cowardice. That's practical." "I know. But even with Caswell and Edwin, I need to know if it's enough." He looked at her directly. "Aldous is cautious. He's going to want the territorial magistrate before he makes any real ruling, and the wire might not produce anyone for days. Cyrus knows that too. He's going to push for an adjournment." "He wants time to manage it," Lenora said. "Yes. Get the room out of public session. Get things back into written filings where he controls what happens to paper." Gideon's voice was flat. He's done it before. Called a public proceeding, and then when it went sideways, requested an adjournment for further review, and then the further review happened in closed session, and nothing changed. Lenora looked at the wall of the county hall. At the stone of it, solid and ordinary, the building that had been the center of Cyrus Vale's operation for 15 years. "He's not going to get the adjournment," she said. He's not going to get it," she said again. Not loudly, but the particular quality of certainty in it stopped Gideon mid-sentence. "When Aldous calls the session back, I'm going to ask that the full county records office be opened today. Not reviewed later. Today in front of independent witnesses." Gideon stared at her. "Aldous has to agree to that." "Aldous is a man who runs fair proceedings. He has been handed enough today that he knows something is wrong. If I ask for the records to be opened in front of witnesses and Cyrus objects," she paused. "An innocent man doesn't object to his records being examined." Edwin was looking at her with something that was edging toward professional admiration. "She's right," he said quietly, "and I can second the request. As county clerk, I have standing to request an internal audit." Gideon looked between them. He was a man who thought in straight lines, and what Lenora was proposing was not a straight line. It was something faster and more exposed and more dangerous than the careful document-by-document approach they had prepared. It could also work in a way the careful approach might not. "All right," he said. He said it the way he said, things he was not entirely comfortable with, but had decided were right. "All right, let's go back in." The recess hour ended and the room filled again, and this time there was a different energy in it, people coming back not from obligation but from genuine investment in what happened next. The way a crowd comes back to something they've started caring about without entirely meaning to. Aldous Harp called the session back. He had the look of a man who had spent his hour doing more than sitting. His papers were reorganized, and he was carrying a new legal text that he set on the table with the quiet purpose of someone who had been reading. Cyrus Vale was already seated. He had used the hour too. His papers were reordered. His posture was recalibrated. Whatever fracture had shown itself before the recess had been worked on. He looked to a casual observer like himself again. Composed, measured, the county commissioner in his good coat. Lenora was not a casual observer. She could see what the hour had cost him to put back together. She had learned in 3 weeks of watching him that composure in Cyrus Vale was always constructed, never natural. It was scaffolding, not the building itself. You could tell the difference if you looked at the right places. The way his left hand rested on the table at a slightly different angle than it had before. The precise arrangement of his papers, a little too precise. The arrangement of a man managing small things because the large things were out of hand. Aldous opened the session, and immediately Cyrus stood. "I'd like to request an adjournment for further written review," he said. "Proceedings today have raised questions that deserve careful consideration beyond what a single session can." "No," Lenora said. She was on her feet. She had not waited for Aldous to respond. Aldous looked at her. "I would like to formally request," Lenora said, "that the county records office be opened today, in this session, for examination by independent witnesses. All files, all ledgers, all private filings. Every document Cyrus Vale has had control over." She paused. "I make this request because the evidence presented this morning indicates that what happened to Gideon Blackthorn and myself was not an isolated act. It was part of a pattern, and if there is a pattern, it exists in those records. And if it exists in those records, it should be seen by this room today, not filed away for review that may or may not happen." The room was very quiet. Aldous Harp looked at Cyrus. "Mr. Vale, do you object to your records being opened for examination?" Question was simple. It was also a trap that Lenora had built very carefully, because the only answer that served Cyrus was the one that destroyed him. He knew it. She could see him knowing it. "The records contain sensitive county business," he said. "Third parties, pending filings, private matters unrelated to—" "Which specific records are sensitive?" Aldous asked. A pause. "I would need to review." "You are the commissioner," Aldous said for the second time that morning. And for the second time the room heard it. Edwin Sutter stood. "As county clerk, I formally second the request for internal examination. I have standing under County Charter Article 4 to call for a records review at any time I have reasonable cause to believe administrative irregularities exist." He looked at Aldous steadily. "I have reasonable cause." Aldous was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to the young clerk near the door. "Get me 3 names. People in this room who are not connected to either party in this proceeding and who have basic literacy. They will serve as witnesses." He looked at Cyrus. "Mr. Vale, your office. We will proceed there immediately following a brief recess." "Aldous, this is highly irregular. So is what has been described to me this morning," Aldous said. "I'm going to be irregular about it." The walk across the main street from the county hall to the records office was 12 years of something compressed into 100 yards. Cyrus walked it in front because he had no choice, and he walked it with the mechanical correctness of a man whose body knew what dignity looked like, even when the rest of him was in free fall. Aldous walked beside him. Gideon and Lenora followed. Edwin walked with his key ring already in hand, the keys he had carried for 14 years and knew by feel in the dark. Maisie stayed at the county hall with the widow Caswell, who had offered without being asked. Because Caswell was a practical woman who understood that an 11-year-old did not need to be in a records office, and Maisie was practical enough to accept this without argument. Inside the records office, Aldous posted the 3 citizen witnesses at different points of the room and instructed them to observe and not to touch anything without being directed. Then he turned to Cyrus. "Your private cabinet," he said. "Start there." Cyrus said nothing. He crossed to the cabinet, the one Edwin had described from 12 years ago, the one with the leather folio in the bottom drawer. He reached for the key at his watch chain. His hand was not entirely steady. Lenora noticed. She believed Gideon noticed too, from the slight change in his posture beside her. Cabinet opened. What was in it was thorough. Cyrus was a thorough man. That had always been his particular quality, the attention to detail that made him effective at managing records and also, it turned out, made him effective at managing people's lives. He had kept files on every case where he had intervened. Not carelessly, they were labeled with anodyne descriptions, filed under routine headings. They were there. The Caswell water rights case. The North Boundary disputes. A file simply labeled BCA 1878 that Aldous picked up and opened and read for a long moment without expression. "Is this your handwriting?" Aldous asked, holding it toward Cyrus. Cyrus looked at it. He looked at it for long enough that the looking itself was an answer. "I managed sensitive correspondence at the request," he began. "Whose request?" Aldous said. Silence. "One of the citizen witnesses, a heavy-set man named Ord, who ran the lumber yard and had the permanent skeptical expression of someone who dealt with measurements all day and had zero tolerance for things that didn't add up," said quietly to the witness beside him. "That's not good." It was not a legal statement. It was the simple observation of a man who knew what he was looking at. The examination took 2 hours. Aldous was systematic, and Edwin was invaluable. He knew exactly where everything was, could identify files by their position and their label, could tell Aldous which sections of the ledger corresponded to which periods, could cross-reference the relay logs against the delivery records, against the case files, in a way that built, piece by piece, a picture that was damning, not because any single piece was catastrophic, but because of the sheer number of them. 9 cases. 9 separate instances across 15 years where records had been delayed, misdirected, filed incorrectly in ways that consistently benefited Cyrus Vale's interests or harmed people who had crossed him. Gideon stood through all of it. He did not say much. He did not need to. He was there as a witness, and as the person who had demanded the records be opened, and the opening was doing the work that 12 years of careful effort had not managed to do. Because the difference between suspecting something and seeing its documentation spread across a table in front of 3 neutral witnesses and a hearing officer was not a small difference. It was everything. At some point during the second hour, Cyrus stopped responding to direct questions. He answered the first several carefully, with alternative explanations that grew progressively less convincing as each new file contradicted them, and then at some point the answers simply stopped coming, and he stood with his hands at his sides and said nothing. And the nothing was more conclusive than anything he had said. Lenora watched him from across the room. She had thought about this moment not in a vindictive way, not exactly, but she had thought about what it would feel like to see Cyrus Vale in a room he could no longer manage. She had thought it would feel like victory or release or some version of the satisfaction she had heard.
Described in stories where justice arrived cleanly.
It did not feel like that. It felt like standing in a room looking at the evidence of 12 lost years laid out in labeled folders, and understanding that what was in those folders could have been opened years ago if someone had looked, if Edwin had spoken sooner, if she had come back instead of running, if a whole chain of ifs that led back to one man who had decided that other people's lives were resources he had the right to spend. She felt tired more than triumphant. She felt something that was not quite grief but was related to it. Gideon moved close beside her, not touching, just close enough that she was aware of him there, which was its own kind of something. "You all right?" he said quietly, under the noise of Aldous directing Edwin to the next section of files. "Yes," she said. Then, more honestly, I thought this would feel different. How? Better. More like I don't know. More like it was enough. Gideon looked at the files on the table, at the patient, terrible arithmetic of everything in them. "It's enough for what needs to happen next," he said. "For you and Maisie and the record being corrected. That's enough for now. The rest of it." He stopped. "Some things don't feel the way they're supposed to feel." "That's just true." Lenora looked at him. He was not looking at her, he was looking at the documents, and his face had the expression it carried when he was being honest about something he had no particular desire to be honest about, which she was beginning to recognize as one of his more consistent qualities. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her then, just briefly. Don't do that yet, he said. Wait until it's done. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Aldous Harp called everyone back to the county hall. The room had not emptied during the examination. People had waited, some of them eating food brought from the boarding house down the street, some of them talking in the low, steady hum of a community working through something large together. The widow Caswell had spent the time talking to Maisie, who had apparently told her, in Maisie's characteristic way, the complete factual account of the last 12 years of their life, in the same tone she might use to describe the weather. Your girl explained everything to me, Caswell told Lenora when they came back in. She was a compact woman in her 60s with the kind of face that had been weathered by the specific outdoor life of a ranching widow. Clear as a bell. Didn't leave anything out. Didn't ask for anything either. She doesn't ask for things, Lenora said. She told me my water rights case was probably in those files, Caswell said. Was it? Lenora looked at her. Yes. Caswell's jaw set. She sat down and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the front of the room with an expression that had moved past patience into something more permanent and less forgiving. Aldous Harp stood at the front of the room and waited for the noise to settle. He had the look now of a man who had started the day expecting a boundary dispute and had ended up somewhere very different, and had made his peace with that. I am going to summarize what the examination of the county records office produced this afternoon, he said. I want this room to understand what we found. Then I will tell you what is going to happen next. He summarized it. He was not dramatic about it. Aldous Harp was not a dramatic man, but he was precise, and precision was its own kind of impact. 9 cases, 15 years, a pattern of records manipulation that had affected water rights, boundary filings, and personal correspondence. Documentation in the commissioner's own files of interventions that were never disclosed to the affected parties. The room was very quiet. When Aldous finished the summary, he looked at Cyrus Vale. Cyrus was seated at the front. He had not run. Lenora had been faintly afraid he might try during the examination, but he had not. She didn't know if that was because he had nowhere to go, or because some part of him had known for years that this was where things were heading and had, on some level, been waiting for it. Men like Cyrus Vale sometimes carried the weight of what they'd done in ways they weren't honest about even with themselves. Mr. Vale, Aldous said, I'm going to ask you one question, and I want the room to hear your answer. Did you intercept correspondence between Gideon Blackthorn and Lenora Ashby in the spring of 1878? Cyrus was quiet. Did you hold those letters? Quiet. Did you arrange for forged correspondence to be delivered to each of them? A long moment the room held. Then Cyrus said, I acted in what I believed were Miss Ashby's best interests. The room was not ready for that answer. Not because it was a denial, it was the furthest thing from a denial. It was an admission wrapped in justification, which was worse than either a denial or a clean confession, because it revealed the specific shape of his thinking. He had done it. He had done it because he had decided he had the right to do it. He had managed 12 years of 2 people's lives, and 9 other cases of other people's lives, because he had decided apparently that his judgment about what was best for people he had not been asked to manage superseded their right to manage themselves. Lenora stood up. She did not ask permission. Aldous did not stop her. You believed it was in my best interest, she said. Her voice was not loud, and it was not shaking. To forge a rejection letter and send it to a man I loved. To intercept 11 years of correspondence. To make my daughter grow up without a father and make him live not knowing she existed. She paused. You did all of that because you thought it was good for me. Cyrus looked at her. Something in his face, the last piece of the constructed composure, shifted and showed underneath it something she had not expected. Not remorse exactly. Something more complicated and less useful than remorse. Particular expression of a person confronting the vast distance between what they believed about themselves and what they actually were. You were going to marry a man with no prospects, he said. You were 20 years old, and you were making a decision that would have minus. It was my decision, Lenora said. It was mine to make. The room was absolutely still, and I was 30 years old, Gideon said from beside her. He had not planned to speak, she could tell, from the slight roughness in his voice. The way it came out before he organized it into something cleaner, but he spoke. And it was mine too, and you took both of them. Cyrus closed his mouth. Whatever he had left to say, he did not say it. Aldous Harp ruled that the proceedings would be referred to the territorial magistrate immediately, that Cyrus Vale was suspended from his position pending the magistrate's review, and that the county records office would be placed under Edwin Sutter's sole authority in the interim. He ruled that the forged correspondence, the intercepted letters, and the documentation from the records examination would all be submitted as evidence to the magistrate's inquiry. He ruled that Maisie's birth record would be corrected and Gideon Blackthorn's name added as father in the official county document, pending no objection from Gideon Blackthorn. No objection, Gideon said, immediately, without hesitation. Maisie, sitting on the bench beside the widow Caswell, made no expression. But her hand found Caswell's arm and held it briefly, and Caswell covered it with her own weathered hand, and neither of them said anything, and that was enough. Cyrus Vale stood to leave. He moved toward the back of the room, and the room parted for him not out of deference, but in the particular way a room moves for someone it is done with, parting of people who have made a decision, and expressed it through the specific courtesy of not looking directly at him as he went. It was not violent. It was not loud. It was the community's version of a door closing, and it was more complete than anything louder would have been. He was almost at the door when he stopped. Decker Prawl was standing in the doorway. Decker had been in the room for parts of the session, coming and going, the way he always came and went, watching Cyrus's face for signals. But Decker had also been in that room long enough to understand what the afternoon had produced, and the expression on his face now was not the expression of a man waiting for instructions. It was the expression of a man who had performed a long professional calculation and arrived at a number he didn't like. "I'm not riding out of town with you," Decker said. Cyrus stared at him. "You're suspended," Decker said. "There's a magistrate coming. Whatever you're going to do in the next 24 hours, I'm not part of it." He stepped aside from the doorway to let Cyrus through. "We're done." Cyrus looked at him for a long moment. Then he walked through the door without answering, which was the first honest thing he'd done all day. County Hall emptied slowly, the way rooms empty after something large, people needing to talk to each other about what they'd witnessed before they could fully leave it. The collective processing of a community that had been confronted with something it hadn't entirely wanted to see about itself. Lenora sat on the bench for a long time after most people had gone. Maisie sat beside her, close, their arms touching. The widow Caswell had gone to find the other ranchers who'd come forward. Edwin Sutter was in conference with Aldous Harp near the front, going through documents with the careful attention of a man taking full ownership of a responsibility he should have claimed years ago. Gideon sat on Lenora's other side. He didn't say anything for a while. Neither did she. Maisie had her cloth bundle in her lap and was turning one of the old letters over in her hands, not opening it, just holding it, the way you hold something that has been important long enough that the holding itself has become a kind of meaning. "What happens now?" Maisie asked. "The magistrate comes," Lenora said. "Probably in a few days. There will be more proceedings. It's not finished yet, but the records are open." "Yes, and the letters are official now, yes." Maisie turned the letter over once more. "And my birth record gets his name. A beat." "Yes," Lenora said quietly. Maisie looked at Gideon across her mother. Gideon looked back at her. Between them on the bench, Lenora was aware of her daughter conducting the same patient assessment she applied to everything, collecting information, turning it over, deciding. "I have a question," Maisie said to Gideon. "All right," he said. "You didn't know me before Monday." "No." "And you still said no objection." "Yes." She looked at him for another moment. "Why?" Gideon was quiet. He was the kind of man who did not answer questions faster than he could answer them honestly, which Lenora was beginning to understand was one of his more consistent qualities and also occasionally an inconvenient one. "Because it's true," he said finally. "You're mine. The record should say so." Maisie turned this over. "Even though we don't know each other yet. That's what yet means," he said. Maisie looked at the letter in her hands for a long moment. Then she put it back in the cloth bundle and tied the bundle closed with the same careful attention she had given to opening it 3 days ago. and she leaned slightly against Lenora's arm, the way she did when she had decided something, and was done with the deciding. Outside the county hall, Mason Hollow was doing what small towns do after something large has moved through them, the business of the evening continuing, horses and wagons and voices on the street. The ordinary texture of daily life that goes on, regardless of what has been overturned inside the buildings along it. But it was going on differently. Because the thing that had been overturned was real, and the people in those buildings had been in that room and had heard those things, and had made their own private reckonings with what they'd done and not done, and believed and not questioned. That process would take longer than a day. Lenora understood that. Communities were slow to reckon and slow to change, and the 12 years they had given Cyrus Vale's version of things could not be undone by a single afternoon's proceedings. There would be people who would not fully believe, or who would believe, and still feel a complicated loyalty to the familiar. There would be awkward silences and careful avoidances and the specific social friction of a town figuring out how to deal with having been wrong. She had no illusions about that. But Edwin Sutter was in the front of the room, being thorough with the man who ran fair proceedings. The widow Caswell's water rights case was in a pile of official evidence. Maisie's birth record was going to have her father's name on it. And 3 neutral witnesses from Mason Hollow had stood in the county records office and seen everything that was in it, and that could not be unfiled or misdirected or made to disappear. It was not everything. It was not 12 years returned to her. It was not Maisie growing up with both her parents, or Gideon not spending a decade in a house with 2 chairs at the table, or all the letters that had been received by nobody arriving in the hands they were written for. It was not any of that, but it was real, and it was today, and it was a beginning not of the kind that came with certainty and clean resolution, but the kind that came with opened records and a room full of witnesses and a hard day behind them and another one ahead, and all of that being enough to build from. Put her hand over Maisie's on the bench. Maisie turned her hand over and held it. Gideon on the other side was quiet and present and real, and outside, the evening light was coming down over Mason Hollow in the long golden way of early spring, and the day was finally, imperfectly done. Territorial magistrate arrived on a Tuesday, 6 days after the hearing. His name was Harlan Pruitt, and he was a compact, gray-haired man of about 60 who had been riding the territory's legal circuit for 23 years and had developed, in that time, the specific patience of someone who had seen every variety of human wrongdoing and had stopped being surprised by any of it without stopping caring about it, which was a harder balance to maintain than it looked. He arrived with 2 deputies and a document case, and the manner of a man who had read the preliminary wire thoroughly and had a reasonable picture of what he was walking into. He spent his first 2 days in Mason Hollow in the records office with Edwin Sutter. Lenora and Gideon were called in on the 3rd day. The proceeding was quieter than the public hearing's smaller room, fewer people, the specific atmosphere of official business being conducted carefully rather than publicly. Magistrate Pruitt asked his questions in the methodical way of a man who already knew most of the answers and was building a structure of official record around them. He was not unkind. He was also not sentimental, which Lenora respected. Sentiment was not what she needed from the law. She needed the law to do what it was supposed to do, which was look at evidence and call things what they were. He asked Lenora to walk him through the timeline from the beginning. She did. She was better at it now than she had been in the county hall, not because the facts had changed, but because she had said them enough times that they no longer caught in her throat. The shame that had lived in certain parts of the story for the 12 years had not entirely left, but it had loosened its grip. Saying true things out loud repeatedly had that effect, she was discovering. The things you were afraid to say had power over you, partly because you kept them inside, where they could grow without light. Put them in a room with a magistrate and a document case, and they became what they actually were: facts, evidences, the record of what one man had chosen to do with other people's lives. Pruitt listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked 3 clarifying questions, all precise, all addressing specific dates in the chain of custody of the documents. Then he looked at the folio on his desk, the one that held the forged letters, the draft, the mail ledger entries, the files from Cyrus's private cabinet, and he was quiet for a moment in the way of a man completing an internal calculation. "Miss Ashby," he said, I want to ask you something that isn't strictly part of the legal record. All right, she said. In your assessment, and you've spent 3 weeks observing him, do you believe Cyrus Vale understood, at the time he did this, that he was causing harm? Or did he genuinely believe he was acting in your interest? Lenora thought about this honestly, the way she tried to think about difficult things. I think both, she said. I think he told himself it was for me. I think he needed to believe that. But I also think on some level he knew that what he actually wanted was to win. And he wanted to win badly enough that he built a story around it that made winning look like generosity. She paused. The most dangerous kind of person isn't the one who knows they're doing wrong. It's the one who has convinced themselves that wrong and right point in the same direction as what they want. Pruitt looked at her for a moment. That is a precise observation, he said. I had 12 years to work it out, she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Cyrus Vale appeared before Magistrate Pruitt on the 4th day. Gideon was not in the room for that proceeding. It was closed session, formal, the legal machinery doing the specific work that legal machinery did. But word moved through Mason Hollow the way word always moved through a small town, quickly, imperfectly, with some details accurate and as others accumulated from the particular creativity of community speculation. What was accurate, Cyrus did not deny the core of it. He could not deny it. The documentation was too complete, too cross-referenced, too thoroughly witnessed. He offered instead the same explanation he had given in the county hall, that he had acted in what he believed were the best interests of the parties involved, and Pruitt, by all accounts, received this explanation with the kind of stillness that was more devastating than any visible reaction. What was also accurate, Cyrus's position as county commissioner was permanently revoked. The territorial authority formally removed him from office, sealed his personal files pending the completion of the investigation, and opened individual review processes for all 9 cases identified in the records examination. Caswell water rights case, the North Boundary disputes. All of them. He left Mason Hollow the following week. Not under physical guard, there was no charge at that stage that required it, though the investigation was ongoing, but he left. And the leaving had the particular quality of a man who understood that the town he had managed for 15 years was no longer manageable, that the thing he had built his authority on the belief, in the people around him, that he was the most powerful fixed point in their world, had been dismantled in a county records office on a Thursday afternoon by a hearing officer who called things what they were. Lenora did not watch him go. She heard about it afterward from Holt, who had been in town for supplies and had seen the wagon leave. Didn't look back, Holt said when he told her. He said it without satisfaction, just as a report. Good, Lenora said, and that was all she said about it. The corrected birth record arrived at Blackthorn Ranch 10 days after the hearing, delivered by Edwin Sutter in person. He wrote out himself, rather than sending it through the county relay. Lenora suspected this was his way of completing something he felt he owed, though he didn't frame it that way. He handed it to Gideon at the door. Gideon read it. He didn't move for a moment. Then he looked at Edwin and said, "Thank you." The flat, understated way he said things that mattered most, and Edwin nodded and said he needed to get back to town, and left without making more of it. Gideon brought the document inside. Maisie was at the table with her arithmetic book, which she had long since finished, and was now supplementing with a history book Gideon had found in the back of a shelf. He had more books than his bare-walled house suggested. Lenora had discovered, stacked in places where he didn't have to look at them. Maisie looked up when he came in. He set the document on the table in front of her. She read it. She was a fast reader. She got to the relevant line in about 4 seconds, and she read it, and then she read it again. Father Gideon Blackthorn. She sat with it for a moment. Gideon stood on the other side of the table and did not fill the silence, which was the right thing to do, and also clearly cost him something. It's official, Maisie said. Yes, the county has to believe it now. County already believed it, he said. Now it's written down. Maisie looked at the document again. Then she folded it carefully along its existing creases and held it out to him. You should keep it, she said. I have the letters. You should have this. Gideon took it. He held it for a moment with both hands in the way of someone who doesn't know what to do with something they have needed for a long time and have finally received. Thank you, he said. Maisie looked at him with the clear, assessing eyes she had turned on him that first morning at the gate, when she had climbed down from the wagon and taken his measure before deciding anything about him. But the assessment was different now. It had information in it that the first one didn't. 2 weeks of watching, of eating at the same table, of learning that he answered questions honestly, even when the honest answer was uncomfortable, of watching him with the horses in the paddock, with the particular quiet competence of someone who had spent years learning how animals needed to be met on their own terms. "You're still scared of getting it wrong," she said. Not unkindly, just accurate, and blinked. "What?" "With me. You're still worried about doing the wrong thing." She tilted her head slightly. "I can tell because you're very careful. You measure everything before you say it." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that bad?" "No," she said. "It means you care about getting it right. I'd rather that than someone who didn't think about it at all." She pulled her arithmetic book back toward her. "You don't have to be so careful all the time, though." "I'm not going to break." Gideon looked at her. At this 11-year-old person who had arrived on his property 2 weeks ago and had proceeded, with complete calm, to say the true thing in every situation where it was needed, without performance, without calculation, with just the simple directness of someone who had decided early that honesty was less exhausting than the alternative. "No," he said, "I don't think you are." The harder conversations came slower, the way harder conversations always do. The one between Gideon and Lenora happened on a Sunday evening, 3 weeks after the hearing, when Maisie was asleep, and Holt had gone to visit his sister in the next county, and the ranch was quiet in the way it was quiet, when there was nobody in it but the two of them and the particular weight of everything they hadn't yet said. They were on the porch. The spring had gotten warmer, not fully warm, but the cold had backed off enough that evening. Air was something you could sit in, rather than just endure. Lenora had a cup of coffee. Gideon had his hands wrapped around nothing, which was his habit when he was thinking hard. "I need to know what you want," he said. It was an abrupt opening. She had learned that about him. He didn't build toward things. He arrived at them, and the arrival was sometimes jarring if you weren't expecting it. "In what sense?" she said carefully, going forward. "You and Maisie." He looked at the yard, at the fence line in the evening dark. "You've been here 3 weeks. Maisie she's settling in like she's been here longer than that. But I don't know what you want this to be, and I think we need to say it plainly instead of letting it drift." Lenora was quiet for a moment. She thought about 12 years of not saying things plainly, and what it had cost them both. "I'm not going to pretend I don't still have feelings for you," she said. "That would be dishonest, and I think we've established that dishonesty is not something either of us has any patience left for." She paused. "But I also know that feelings are not the same as a plan. And what happened between us was 12 years ago, and we're different people. And I'm not going to ask you to pick up where we left off, because where we left off doesn't exist anymore." Gideon looked at her. "What does exist?" "This," she said. "What's here? 2 people who knew each other once and are getting to know each other again. A girl who is ours and who deserves a real answer about what her life looks like going forward." She looked at her coffee cup. "I'm not going to push you into something that isn't ready. But I'm also not going to keep living in your storage room indefinitely, because we're both too careful to say what we actually want." "What do you actually want?" he said. She looked at him directly. "Stay. To build something real here, with Maisie, with you if you want that too. Not because of the past. Because of what I've seen in the last 3 weeks." She paused. "But I need you to want it for the right reasons. Not guilt. Not obligation because of Maisie. Not just because it's easier than saying no." Gideon was quiet for long enough that she was briefly afraid she had misjudged everything. Then he said, "I spent 12 years not understanding why any of it mattered. Why I kept the ranch running. Why I worked to expand the east section. Why I put the second bedroom in even though there was nobody to use it." He stopped. "I told myself it was just what you did. You kept going. You built things. But the truth is, I was building for something I couldn't name." He looked at her. "I'm not doing this out of guilt. I'm doing it because you walked through my gate 3 weeks ago and the house made sense for the first time in 12 years. And I'm aware that is probably not the most articulate thing I've ever said." "It's articulate enough," Lenora said. A pause. "The storage room cot is genuinely terrible," she said. He almost laughed. "It It was closer than the almost smile had been in the magistrate's proceeding room, and she counted it. "I know," he said. "I've been meaning to do something about that." "Good," she said. They sat with that for a while, not resolution exactly, not the clean arrival at a new understanding, but the first honest statement of what they both wanted, which was its own kind of beginning. The imperfect, undramatic, real kind. In June, Gideon found himself standing on the eastern hill of the ranch at the old foundation he had not visited in 12 years. He had started building a house there in 1877. He had gotten as far as the foundation and the framing before everything stopped. And then the weeks of confusion and the letter and the understanding that Lenora was gone had made the unfinished frame on the hill something he simply could not look at, and so he had stopped looking at it. And 12 years of weather and neglect had done to it what 12 years of weather and neglect does to unfinished things. He was clearing weeds from the foundation stones when he heard Lenora come up the hill behind him. He had not told her he was going up there. He hadn't planned to go himself. He had just walked in that direction one morning without entirely deciding to. She stopped at the edge of the foundation and looked at it. "I didn't know this was here," she said. "I started it before he stopped." In 1877, she looked at the foundation stones, at the remains of the framing half collapsed now, the wood gone gray and soft with age. She was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was understanding something she hadn't known to ask about. "You were building it for us," she said. "Yes." She stood there for a moment. Then she said, "I always wanted a window facing east. In whatever house we ended up in, I used to think about it." "Morning light," he looked at her. "You told me that once." "Before." I remembered it. She looked at him. "I can build it," he said. "The foundation is still good." The stone held. He looked at the hillside, at the view from it, the full eastern range of the ranch land, the creek line visible in the distance, the kind of view that deserved a window. "It would take time. I'd need help." "Mason Hollow has people who know how to build things," Lenora said slowly. "Some of them owe us a fair amount at this point," he said without bitterness. Just as a fact. She looked at the foundation again. There was something in her face that he was learning to read the expression she carried. Flesh and spirit, when she was deciding whether to let herself want something, when she was weighing the specific risk of hope that had burned her before. "Let's build it," she said. The building of the house on the eastern hill was not a smooth or organized affair, and anyone who tells you that community acts of repair and restitution are graceful and uncomplicated has never actually participated in one. People came. That part was true. Neighbors who had been silent during Cyrus Vale's years in power showed up with lumber and nails and tools and food. And some of them came with apologies that were clear, and some with apologies that were buried inside offers of help, and some without apologies at all, just the labor itself, which Lenora accepted in all its forms, because she understood that people expressed remorse the way they expressed most things imperfectly, in the available language, at the pace their own discomfort would allow. It was awkward sometimes. The widow Caswell showed up on the second Saturday and worked harder than 3 people half her age, which was uncomplicated. A man who had publicly agreed with Cyrus during an earlier land dispute showed up and didn't quite know how to look at Gideon directly, which was complicated. A woman who had snubbed Lenora in the dry goods store 3 weeks earlier arrived with a pot of food and an elaborate cordiality that was clearly not comfortable for either of them. And Lenora thanked her for the food and put it on the table, and that was the full transaction, and it was enough. Maisie observed all of it with her characteristic attention to accuracy. "That man with the red suspenders feels bad," she told Lenora one evening, watching the day's workers head back toward town. "Yes," Lenora said. "He does. He didn't actually do anything. He didn't say anything when he could have. Sometimes that's its own kind of doing." Maisie thought about this. "Is it enough that he came?" "It's a start," Lenora said. "Most things are. Gideon worked on the house every day regardless of who else was there. On the days with help, it went faster. On the days without, it went slower, and he worked longer. He was not a man who talked much about what things meant to him, but Lenora had gotten better at reading the language of what he did instead of what he said, and what he did was work on that house with the specific commitment of a person finishing something they had needed to finish for 12 years. Maisie started helping in the afternoons after her schoolwork. She had a good eye for straight lines, which Gideon discovered when she pointed out without comment that the kitchen window frame was a quarter-inch off level. Checked it, found she was right, and corrected it without making anything of it. And after that, he occasionally asked her to check his measurements, which she did with the solemnity of someone taking a professional responsibility seriously. One afternoon in late July, while they were working on the framing for the east-facing window, the one that was the whole reason for the house being positioned where it was Maisie was holding the level, and Gideon was adjusting the frame, and she said, without looking up from the level, "Pa." It came out the way words come out when they've been considered for a long time, and finally said not dramatically, just quietly, the word itself carrying the full weight of the considering. Gideon went still. His hands were still on the window frame. He did not move them. He stood there for a moment with the specific stillness of a man who has received something he has wanted without knowing how to hold it. "Yeah," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. He did not try to make it steady. He had learned from Lenora that some things did not need to be managed, that there was a difference between controlling your reaction and pretending it wasn't there. Maisie looked up at him with the level still in her hands. She assessed the state of his face with her customary directness. "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said. "You look like you might not be." "I'm all right," he said. Give me a minute." She gave him a minute. She went back to checking the level. He went back to adjusting the frame. The September wind moved through the hill, and the half-built house creaked gently around them, the sounds of something in the process of becoming. When Lenora came up with water an hour later, she found them working with the particular companionable quiet of two people who have reached a new understanding and are inhabiting it rather than talking about it. She looked at Gideon's face, and something in it told her something had shifted, and she didn't ask, because some things were between the two of them, and she was not required to be present for all of it. She handed out the water and sat on the foundation stones and watched them work. And the late afternoon light came long and warm across the eastern hillside, and the window frame stood straight and true against the sky. They married in September, beside the creek, where they had first fallen in love 20 years ago, as young people who had no idea what was coming. It was not an elaborate occasion. Lenora had no patience for elaborate, and Gideon had no talent for it, and Maisie had said plainly that large gatherings made her tired. So they kept it to the people who had actually been present for what mattered: Holt, the widow Caswell, Edwin Sutter with his careful hands and his 14-year-old guilt partially discharged, and a handful of neighbors whose presence was earned rather than assumed. Magistrate Pruett had returned to his circuit weeks earlier, but he had sent a written note that Edwin read aloud, which was unexpectedly moving in the way that straightforward things sometimes are. They made their vows simply and in their own words, which were imperfect and honest and slightly awkward in the specific way of people who are not performers and did not try to perform. Gideon's voice caught once briefly. Lenora's hands were not entirely steady. Neither of them pretended otherwise. Maisie stood between them during the ceremony, which had not been formally planned, but had happened naturally, because she had moved to that position and nobody had redirected her. Afterward, when someone the widow Caswell asked her how she felt, she said good. Like things are in the right order now, which was, Lenora thought, the most accurate description of the day she could have offered. The house on the eastern hill was finished in late October. They moved in on a Saturday, the four of them: Lenora, Gideon, Maisie, and Holt, who had been roped into carrying furniture and managed to knock the kitchen table into the doorframe twice, which was the most noise he had made in 8 years of employment. The house was plain and well built, and it smelled of new wood and the cold that came in through the gaps they hadn't caulked yet, and it was nothing like perfect and entirely like home. Maisie's room was at the end of the hall. She had arranged it herself, with the bed against the east wall and her cloth bundle on the bedside table, and her little wooden horse on the windowsill facing out, as if it were watching the land. Lenora went in to say good night on the first night, and found Maisie already in bed, which was unusual. Maisie was not typically an early sleeper. "You're in early," Lenora said. "I wanted to see what it felt like," Maisie said. "To be in a room that's mine." Lenora sat on the edge of the bed. "And," Maisie considered. "Quiet," she said, in a good way. "Not like we were hiding. Just quiet." Lenora smoothed the blanket. "You've never had a room of your own before, I know." She turned her head to look at the window. The sky outside was clear and dark, and the stars were out. We moved so much. Yes. Are we done moving? Lenora looked at the room, at its bare walls and its single window and its new woods smell, and the cloth bundle on the table that had traveled 11 years of frontier to be here. Yes, she said. We're done moving. Maisie seemed to settle something inside herself. Good, she said, and closed her eyes. On their first full morning in the new house, Lenora woke before dawn. She lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar room, in the unfamiliar quiet of a house that was hers, and she listened to the particular sounds of a ranch, at first light the horses moving in the paddock, a bird somewhere, the wind through the eaves of a house that was new enough to still be finding its own sounds. Gideon was already awake. She could tell from the stillness of him, the specific quality of someone who is lying still and not sleeping. You're thinking too loud, she said. Sorry, don't be. She turned onto her back. What are you thinking about? He was quiet for a moment. That I wasted a lot of years. Cyrus Vale wasted them, she said. I let them be wasted. He said it the way he said the hard, honest things, flatly, without self-pity, just the fact as he understood it. I could have pushed harder, questioned the letter more. Gone looking, he paused. Instead, I closed around it and stayed closed. Lenora thought about 20-year-old Gideon, receiving a letter from the woman he loved, telling him she had chosen someone else. Thought about what that did to a person, not the dramatic version, but the quiet, daily version. The closing down that happened over time when you decided the thing you wanted most wasn't for you. We all have the list of what we could have done differently, she said. That list is not the same as blame. She looked at the ceiling. What I've come to think in the years I've had to think about it is that the choices we made from fear were still our choices. We own them, but fear is a real thing. It acts on people. Cyrus knew how to use it, and he used it, and that is his that belongs to him, not us. She paused. What we do now is ours. The list of what we're building, that's the one that matters. Gideon was quiet. Then, from down the hall, the distinct sound of Maisie's door and Maisie's feet and Maisie's voice. Their breakfast. Lenora almost laughed. Gideon did laugh, a short, real one, the kind that came from somewhere genuine. There will be, he called back. When? Give us 10 minutes. Pause from the hallway. Then I'll wait in the kitchen. The sound of her feet going down the hall, patient and practical, already at home. Gideon looked at Lenora. She looked at him. In the early dark of the room, with the sounds of the waking ranch coming through the walls of a house that had an east-facing window, and a daughter who had claimed her own room, and a marriage that was imperfect and unfinished and real, there was nothing that needed to be said that wasn't already being said by everything around them. The dawn came slowly, the way it always does. Light found the east window and came through it the way Lenora had imagined it for 12 years, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, the way real things arrive. It moved across the floor of the room in a long pale bar, and it was ordinary, and it was morning, and it was theirs. There are people who spend years looking at the closed door, the relationship that was taken, the years that were stolen, the life that should have been. They map it so thoroughly that the map becomes more real than anything in front of them. That is what grief does, and grief is real, and it deserves its due. There is a point, different for every person, where the looking back becomes its own kind of keeping yourself from living, and the only way through it is to turn around. Not to forget. Forgetting is not the goal, and it is not possible. You carry what happened to you. You carry the lost years and the forged letters, and the 11 winters of doing everything alone, and all the small daily costs of being afraid for too long. You carry all of it, but you decide what you're carrying it toward. Lenora had made that decision the morning she turned her wagon toward Mason Hollow instead of away from it. Gideon had made it the morning he said, "We go to the hearing." Maisie had made it, in her particular undemonstrative way. Every morning she woke up and decided that the world was worth engaging with honestly, which was the bravest kind of decision and the one she made most quietly. The past was what it was. It was not coming back differently. Cyrus Vale was gone from Mason Hollow, and the records were open, and the birth certificate said the right name, and none of that returned a single one of the 12 years to the people it had been taken from. But the years ahead were still unwritten. That was not a small thing. In fact, it was the whole thing. Down the hall, Maisie was in the kitchen. waiting for breakfast with her customary patience, her wooden horse on the windowsill facing east, the morning finding her in a room that was finally fully hers. She was not waiting to be rescued or restored or returned to something. She was just waiting for breakfast, in her house, with her family, in the ordinary way of someone who has decided that the day in front of her is worth showing up for. The light through the east window was full now. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.